Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Brian Waterman. I'm a member of the Arts and Humanities faculty here at NYUAD, and so it's my job to welcome you here, and thank you for coming. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists tonight, who will be engaged in conversation and I think show you some selections of work that they've accumulated and host on the website ubu.com. If you want to, I think they'll show you, but if you want to find the archive or make note of it, you can find it at ubu.com/Bidoun. First, I'll introduce Tiffany Malakooti, who's a Brooklyn-based graphic designer. She's the head of special projects for Bidoun. And if you don't know Bidoun, since 2004, this group has aimed to fill what the editors perceived as a gaping hole in the arts and culture coverage of the Middle East. Through their publishing, educational, and curatorial projects, Bidoun has pioneered a distinctive voice for raising new questions, images, and ideas about the region. And so for nearly a decade, Bidoun's projects have included a range of pursuits, including curatorial initiatives, educational programs, artist commissions, talks, tours, performances, books, an itinerant library, which is quite an exciting project you can find information about online, and also an online archive of avant-garde media, which is what Tiffany and Kenneth will be talking mostly about tonight. This is a project that Tiffany curates, and I'll let her describe it in more detail. Tiffany grew up in Toronto and studied at the California Institute of the Arts. She runs a blog about Iranian artifacts called Belog, B-E-L-O-G, which you can also find fairly easily online. Tonight she'll be in conversation with Kenneth Goldsmith. Kenneth is the founder of the online art, sound, film, and literature archive called ubu.com, which hosts Bidoun's online archive. He founded Ubu in 1996 to serve as an online repository for the preservation and distribution of avant-garde work in many forms and disciplines. He's a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's a senior editor of another online poetry archive called Pen Sound. He's the author of several books, I think 10 or so, of conceptual poetry. Most recently, a book called 7 American Deaths and Disasters, which is actually only about a month old, and which I highly recommend. And he's currently serving as the first poet laureate of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He travels widely to lecture on art and writing in the digital age, and we are really lucky to have him here because he almost missed a plane in Mexico City and wouldn't have been able to make the connection to be here. But in Mexico City, he was lecturing on the practice of archiving as folk art. So please join me in welcoming Tiffany Malakooti and Kenneth Goldsmith to NYUAD and to Abu Dhabi.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Really thrilled to be here. And I guess this is not really about me. This is about Tiffany and Tiffany's archiving and preservation of avant-garde materials from the Middle East. But I can sort of talk a little bit about how we came to meet each other. As Brian said, I edit and founded this great archive of avant-garde art called UbuWeb. It's the internet's largest archive of avant-garde art. And like most avant-garde art, it follows a narrative that is well-known, very well-known in the West, and kind of pioneered by MoMA, and except with a slight difference that MoMA might focus on Kirchwitter's paintings, whereas UbuWeb focuses on Kirchwitter's poetry and sound poetry and ephemera. UbuWeb is a giant archive of avant-garde artists' ephemera. So very quickly through the, I can just show you, this would be the UbuWeb's film and video section. Many familiar names that you'll see here from Francis Bacon to Marcel Duchamp and the Lumiere brothers, contemporary artists like Paul McCarthy, and musicians like Sonny Chirac, and there's Gertrude Stein, and on it goes. There are probably 3,000 or 4,000 avant-garde full-length films on the site, And the sound section doesn't look that much different. The sound section has people, a lot of sound poets, a lot of people like John Cage and Morton Feldman and Arnold Schoenberg. So basically, the problem with the site is that by following the narrative of MoMA's narrative of what the avant-garde is, it's predominantly white, male, and extremely Western, okay? That kind of coming with the turf. I was fortunate enough to meet Tiffany. A mutual friend of ours was working at Bidoun. She said, oh, you've got to meet Tiffany. She's got some great Middle Eastern avant-garde stuff. And I said, perfect. This is what we really need. We really need to expand our definition of what avant-garde is, particularly on a site this size. And Tiffany brought over a hard drive, and she started playing things that absolutely blew me away. Things that sounded, like nothing I've ever heard before, and then things that sounded very familiar to what I've heard before. A lot of electronic music, a lot of sound poetry, a lot of plunderphonic work, things that were cut up, and I said, gee, this really makes sense. And so we kind of came up with this idea that Tiffany and Bidoun would build a new part of UbuWeb called Bidoun Presents. And now it looks small, and it's not, because a lot of this stuff goes real deep. And this is probably about 3 years old, our collaboration. And it's still growing, and it's still very much a work in process. I mean, compared to the other things, you can see how small it is. And we have unlimited bandwidth and unlimited server space. We can take much more.
I will give you much more.
If you have it for us. So at this point, I'm going to kind of now switch seats with Tiffany, since you see the way that this thing is kind of playing out. And I'm going to kind of talk to you and ask you some questions and have you show everybody some of what you're thinking about curating this archive of Middle Eastern avant-garde art.
Should I show things, or you want to?
Yeah, why don't we start off by showing people something?
Okay.
I think would be great.
So, as Kenny said, some of the things that I played for him were like nothing that he had heard before, and some of the things were very familiar. So there's a big range of stuff on the UbuWeb section. UbuWeb is what we've nicknamed it, Bidoun and UbuWeb. And it's a range from the region, from Central Asia and South Asia, Armenia, Georgia, to throughout the Middle East, the Arab world, Iran, North Africa, and all the way to Senegal. And a lot of work from diasporic artists as well, and a lot of collaborative works, and oftentimes a lot of works that were made in institutional collaborations. So, for instance, the Iranian government paid for Agnes Varda to go to Iran in the 70s and make a documentary there. So, yeah, I think a good way to start would be to just look at some stuff. So this is a film that perhaps maybe people are already familiar with. It's an Iranian poet, Forough Farrokhzad, who also made one film before she died, and it's a experimental film. It's a documentary about a leper colony in Iran. It's from 1962, and I'm just gonna show.
دنیا زشتی کم ندارد. زشتی های دنیا بیشتر بود اگر آدمی بر آنها دیده بسته بود. اما آدمی چاره ساز است. بر این پرده اکنون نقشی از یک زشتی، دیدی از یک درد خواهد آمد که دیده بر آن بستن دور است از مروت آدمی. این زشتی را چاره ساختن، به درمان این درد یاری گرفتن و به گرفتاران آن یاری دادن، مایه ساختن این فیلم و امید سازندگان آن بوده است.
خدایا تو را شکر میگویم که مرا آفریدی. تو را شکر میگویم که مادر دلسوز و پدر مهربانی مرا آفریدی.
تو را شکر میگویم که آب روان و درختان پر میوه را آفریدی.
تو را شکر میکنم که به من دست دادی تا کار کنم.
تو را شکر میگویم که به من چشم داده تا زیبایی های جهان را ببینم.
تو را شکر میگویم که به من گوش داده تا از آهنگ‌ها خوش لذت ببرم.
تو را شکر میگویم که به من پا داده تا به هر کجا که میخواهم بروم.
در حاوی کیست که تو را حمد میگوید ای خداوند؟ در حاوی کیست؟
So yeah, the collaboration with Ubu began because we had a lot of material and we had been posting some of it online, but UbuWeb has this wonderful infrastructure in place, and it's a wonderfully central location for all these materials, which are often floating around on the internet, but are hard to get to unless you know how. And so it was a natural fit for us to kind of be absorbed into the Ubu website. So here we have an Egyptian filmmaker who traveled to Italy in 1970 to study film, and he made a film in collaboration with an Italian, and it features also music by an Egyptian composer. It's a 90-minute film. I'm just showing a very short clip. Here's some animation by Ali Akbar Saadavi, who's an Iranian painter and animator. And we're lucky to have about 5 or 6 of his animations on here that were produced predominantly in the 70s that are mostly based on folk stories. But Just look at one more thing.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that cartoon, that animation, who was that made for, and where would that be screened? I mean, it's,
Sure.
can you tell us a little about
Well,
the
that was
context?
produced by an organization called Kanun Parverish Fikri, which was a state-sponsored institution, which it's called the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, and the idea was to produce materials ranging from books to animations to films for young people. And it also had a second tier to the project, which was more humanitarian in nature, where it promoted literacy in more rural areas, et cetera. They had a traveling library project, which was pretty incredible. But it was founded in the 60s, and it was paid for by the Shah, and it quickly turned into an incubator for some of the most avant-garde artists of that time. And so there was a whole range of people who are now quite famous that got their start there. For instance, Abbas Kiarostami, who's arguably the most famous Iranian filmmaker, started making short films, kind of didactic short films for Kanun. And so this would be, so it was paid for by Kanun, it would be paid for by the government, and and they had, at the time, there was a pretty lively animation scene, so there were animation festivals, film festivals happening in Tehran, and I think there was a lot of dialogue between kind of a lot of stuff happening in Eastern Europe at the time, because I think there was kind of definitely some parallels in terms of the type of work they were making, this kind of like surreal animation work, and so I think there was just different festival circuits that this stuff traveled in. So I don't know how many kids would actually get to see something like that. Maybe if they were taken to the festival, and occasionally, I mean, very, very rarely will this stuff get shown. And we were lucky enough to get all these videos from the son of the guy who made it, who was traveling in America, and he brought a DVD for us with all this stuff. And so, yeah, so this would be, this is super hard to find material, and so.
So Bidoun is a magnet for all of this kind of orphaned work or work that heirs have inherited, and kind of like, we don't know what to do with this stuff, so we're going to bring it to you guys. And what do they want you to do with it, besides put it up on the web? And is everybody okay about putting all this stuff up, or is it in their interest, or where, situate that for us?
I mean, it's probably the same thing that you experience on UbuWeb. It's mixed. Sometimes artists are happy to have their work up here because people get to see it and because it's in good company. And then other times people are shocked by the idea that people can see these things for free, et cetera. And so there's a range, and sometimes we ask, and sometimes we don't ask, and sometimes we get it directly from the people. Sometimes the people are no longer alive.
Let's say we don't host this up on Ubu.
Okay.
So where could I see this elsewhere? Are there festivals where this stuff plays these days, or can I go to a theater downtown here and see it? I can't. Why
I mean,
not?
the first one I showed you is probably the most famous thing that we have up there. I don't know was anyone familiar with that film? That one has definitely been released. It has a DVD that you could buy. And I'm sure there's a lot of Iranian cinema classes that might be one of the first films that you watch. So probably in schools all over the world, people are watching that film, and from time to time it makes it into a festival. But that animation, I would say, once a decade will get shown in an animation festival or something like that. People don't see that. People don't get to see that stuff.
Is there scholarship around this work? Has there been a lot of writing around, say, those animations and the incubators that form that, or is this really a lost history that you're trying to resurrect?
Yeah, it is a partially lost history. I mean, there's so many different things on UbuWeb and from so many different places, and each of those places has a unique history. but there's not so much scholarship. In the case of the animations, I would say no, there is not that much scholarship about it. And that is a void that Bidoun is interested in filling, so especially now, because now is the moment where very soon a lot of the people that were producing work in the 60s and 70s will no longer be alive. It's just in a I don't know how long that takes, but so we privilege conducting interviews in the magazine very much so, just to document the original people that were present and what they have to say. And I mean, my colleague, the editor of the magazine, Nagar Azimi, is currently working on a book that is more or less going to tell the story of that moment in Iranian modernity. So the openings of museums and similar moment to now.
Are museums working on similar preservation efforts of these artifacts from the Middle East?
I mean, that film, that Egyptian film that we watched was screened at MoMA about a year or two ago.
Is it in the collection there?
I think that it might be now, and it was part of an Arab cinema program that was. It was a history of experimental Arab film. It was a 3-part program. So I think some of these things, I'm sure the Fourouk Farrokhzad film is definitely being preserved in multiple places. But again, there's a big range. But there's definitely a few things. I mean, there's a few things we have on here that are also that don't even fall in the framework of art making. We have this Parviz Khatibi video, which was made for television and as a piece of, as a social protest. It's an hour-long program that was made for Iranian satellite television. But in my mind, it's a fantastically avant-garde piece of work. But it was made for television, and nobody's going to preserve that ever.
Really?
Yeah, it's a video.
Can we see a
yeah,
small touch of that?
it's a political piece.
And look at that, isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, I mean, it's really...
Video, look at that, it's so gorgeous.
It's humor. So Parviz Khatibi was
line one.
He was an Iranian radio... He did everything. He had a radio program, and he had... he made movies, he made television, he wrote poetry, and, he was mostly working in satire. He works with kind of vernacular forms, so this is a type of Iranian song, and this is the Iranian New Year mascot. But he uses montage techniques in here. He uses like real footage, and he mixes it with, he wrote all this original music. It's actually, it doesn't have subtitles, but it's incredible. This is one of my favorite things. Maybe we have to skip ahead. That's him. So here she uses this footage and she's talking over it. Yeah. But he was, thrown in jail under several regimes. This part's incredible. And we'll save that for another time.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
I think there's too much context required for that one, maybe.
Huh, look beautiful to me.
Yeah, it does look quite beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I have a question. Were there other, I mean, obviously the focus here is on there's so much Iranian content. Were there other, because it was an incubator for this kind of work, but across the Middle East, were there other similar initiatives that governments were becoming incubators for things that went both popular and avant-garde? And if so, can you talk about some of the other efforts from some of the other countries?
Yeah, I think that Iraq definitely had a burgeoning modern art scene at that time, and they had a biennial and things like that. I think that where else in terms of the state incubating? I mean, there was everything's a little bit different. In Lebanon, there's a Palestinian organization, Dar al-Fatah al-Arabi, that was a PLO funded, mostly PLO funded it was a publishing house for kids' books, kind of, and it's similar to Kanu, and although very different, obviously, kind of turned into an incubator for the best, illustrators and artists of that time, and they were making these really incredible children's books. So things like that were happening also, yeah.
So we keep talking about were, as if everything's in the past tense, and this being somewhat of a historical archive. I mean, can you kind of make some connections between what's going on now and what was going on then, and kind of bring this all into a contemporary context?
Sure. I mean, what's happening here is definitely similar. In terms of
talk about that.
In terms of, I'd say, a lot of money and effort being given to kind of incubating the arts and culture and stuff like that, and so that's one parallel. But I think that a lot of contemporary artists like to see this stuff because there isn't really, like you said, when you're building UbuWeb, it's modeled on MoMA's idea and definition of what the avant-garde is, because there is a canon of what the accepted avant-garde is, and it's there isn't like so much in the Middle Eastern world like a kind of central canon of what the history of the avant-garde is here, or what
Can I ask you about that?
Sure.
Why is that lacking, that canon and that narrative? Or just
I just think that I mean, on the first hand, I think that because all these places have such specific histories, and the work that was made, I think, is so directly related to the context that it was being made in and who was paying for it, and things like that, so that everyone has such a specific, complicated history. It wasn't just, New York in the 60s, and that's just what happened.
Right, it wasn't an international movement the way that modernism
Yeah, I mean, things are obviously related. I mean, the story of, the modernism in Iran was very much about, kind of this conversation we had about architecture the other day, that was very much about adapting kind of vernacular forms and folk stories and, calligraphy and all these things, and reconciling them with some other kind of new aesthetics. And I think that that's a really common story in modernities throughout the world, from East Asia to, yeah.
No, could you tell some of those other stories about the different modernisms and how they responded specifically to geopolitical and historical events, and how they arose in various parts of the Arab world?
Sure. Wait. Okay. Ask me more specific questions.
Well, I mean, you could talk about, as you just said, there was an Iranian modernism that took into account architecture and probably some Western ideas to respond specifically to its political and cultural context. Let's say, Egypt. Can you tell the story of that, or Lebanon?
Sure. Yeah, I think they're quite similar. Similar stories. Yeah. Whatever the folk art is, and I mean, it's a story that we still see today in contemporary art. A lot of Middle Eastern contemporary art is the same thing. Is just kind of finding this in between some of the forms, and taking elements from traditional forms, and yeah, trying to push them a little bit further, or critique them, or.
And how much overlap was there from one center of? I love this idea of local modernisms. I think that's really a beautiful idea as compared to the international style of Western modernism. But how much bleeding over and between the countries was there? And
there was bleeding over. There was definitely bleeding, but it was definitely like there were specific bleedings between. There were lines between certain places and not lines between other places. Like I said before, Iran and the Soviet stuff had a relationship. And, Iran and Iraq had a relationship, and Lebanon and Palestine had a relationship. And there were funny things that happened, like Andy Warhol goes to Kuwait in the 70s, and or Agnes Varda goes to Iran, and so there are all these different kind of intersections that were happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure you have things to say or to ask Tiffany about this, and we can continue talking, but I'd love to invite you to join in or share some knowledge about this this stuff that Tiffany can add to or elucidate upon. If anybody would like to jump in, we're happy to have you join the conversation.
Hello.
Hi.
So what I was saying is I don't really understand what you would define avant-garde as within the Middle Eastern culture, because when you talk about avant-garde, you kind of think about like Europe and America and all of these Western civilizations. And I think that there is a really awesome period that Bidoun really likes to play a lot on, and that is the mix of like this Westernization of Arabic culture, where like, it's almost humorous it is definitely humorous to look at these things and like see these amazing American concepts that are blending into this Middle Eastern art. And you guys, take it a step further and like really, make it obnoxious almost. And it's almost its own art itself. I mean, I love it. It's amazing. So, there's this period, and then you have like revolutions where art, is the number one thing that's kind of thrown out of cultures, like in Iran, music and art were the first parts that were taken away. So
but then quickly brought back.
Yeah, exactly, and because of the fact that they're taken away, more is produced. And like, I just want to understand what you guys see as avant-garde, and what, do you consider this, Western pop art, or not art, but like Western pop commercialization that's being brought into the Middle East and kind of played upon? Do you consider that avant-garde as well? I mean, is that something that you guys see as being different? And
yeah, I mean, obviously, I just showed you that thing that was made for TV, so that definitely doesn't, there's a lot of things that wouldn't fall in a traditional avant-garde category. I think it's just things that are experimental, and I think that things are, there's like two ways to look at this stuff. We could look at it just for its just by watching it, For instance, the Egyptian filmmaker we watched, the Nagi Shaker, that could have been made anywhere. But the context is pretty significant to a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the stuff up here has really complicated backstories that are super duper interesting. We have, this, and we try and include some text in some of them, or a lot of them relate back to projects that we've taken on in the magazine. But, for instance, we have this film, which, wouldn't really fall into an avant-garde category. I think it's experimental in a way, but not avant-garde by any means. It's a film that the filmmaker Albert Lamouris, he's a French filmmaker who made The Red Balloon, which is probably a film that a lot of people know. And he was hired to make a documentary about Iran. And he came and he shot a lot of helicopter footage, and he made this very, very sweet folkloric documentary about Iran. And then, but it was too pastoral and too rural, and it was rejected by the Shah because it didn't reflect kind of all these modernizations that had been taking place, which is what he wanted to show to the world. And so he was, he had finished the film, he was brought back, and told to reshoot some scenes in the city and in a car factory and in a dam, this really amazing new dam that had been built. And he had some concerns about some wires in the dam. They assured him it would be okay. And of course, his helicopter got caught in the wires and he died in this dam, and that's the way that he died. And this is my really quick rundown of that story, but it's actually, a crazy story and a crazy allegory for exactly the kind of things that were happening at that moment. But so it's just, I don't know, it's just stories that need to be told and things that people need to see. Yeah, I guess I really, really digressed a lot there.
I think the whole idea of avant-garde is truly problematic. But I think it's great. 20 years ago, you weren't allowed to use the word avant-garde. It had patriarchal and hegemonic associations, and in the postmodern period, it was really, wow, you couldn't use that word. But there was something about the orphaned term now that became very useful in thinking about the avant-garde in terms of impure histories. What if we took the avant-garde and we kind of made it less pure? And on Ubu, I think there's a lot of kind of revisionism in that way. There's a lot of stuff that really never fit into an avant-garde canon there. But it seems to make sense now that we've kind of rethought what those things could be about, now that we're over purity, now that we're kind of done with that. There's a part of Ubu that has a lot of sort of outsider art and, art of the insane. There's a lot of rock and roll, stuff that might not fit in, to traditional notions of avant-garde. Certainly a lot of political and gender-oriented stuff that also wouldn't have fit into that. So I like the problematics of the term a lot, and I kind of think in a digital world, the idea of multimedia and kind of crashing together of disparate genres that might not fit together in master narratives, but actually fit together beautifully in unofficial and sub-narratives is the kind of thing that I'm trying to engage here on the site. So the fact that, we don't really know what avant-garde is. I kind of think, and this is what I love about your curating of the Bidoun part of Ubu, is that it seems kind of incomplete. It seems kind of impure. It feels very intuitive. It feels like Tiffany kind of thinking her way through. But in a weird way, this is how the histories are being made today. This idea of personal narratives, personal archiving, stitching together things that mean something to you. Now, I think if somebody else would put this together, an archive together of avant-garde, Middle Eastern art, it would be something quite different.
Yeah, because we're not, we're talking about how the canon doesn't really exist, and we're not really interested in creating it. We're just interested in disseminating materials that are hard to find and that people may find interesting, and the untold stories. So just the same way you said that you're more interested in Kurt Schwitter's poetry than the other stuff, it's I think it's similar in that we're interested in kind of the margins too, a little bit. And so yeah, we're definitely not trying to create an authoritative canon. Some things are overrepresented, some things are...
But this is the problem, if you're the only one doing it, it becomes authoritative. Simply because nobody else is doing this.
Yeah.
Wow,
I mean,
you know what, you're writing the
history.
history.
Yeah, there are obviously people working, a lot of people around the world studying.
But who else is making a free archive of it?
Yeah, people aren't making a free archive.
It's kind of, if you build the archive, you actually end up owning that subject. I think this is something the web is taught.
Do you own the Western avant-garde?
I do. I mean, because UbuWeb is the only one doing this, and I think it's really problematic. But because UbuWeb doesn't care about copyright, we tend to think, copyright, what's that? Never heard of it. We just put stuff up, and we've been doing it for 17, 18 years, and we've never had a problem with it. But the problem with building archives is that people are very hung up on copyright. And NYU, if NYU wanted to build an archive of anything, they'd have to get everything would have to be signed off, everything would have to be permissions paid, royalties paid perhaps.
Yeah,
it would take teams of lawyers and mounds of paperwork and millions of dollars to create something that we do every day for free. And since no money is exchanged on UbuWeb, no money is taken in, no money is given out, it's sort of a utopian situation for the distribution of these types of artifacts. So individuals end up then creating histories because bureaucracies have their hands tied so heavily with legal obligations that they can't do anything. And a point in fact is MoMA's website. Now I love dear MoMA, and we keep talking about it, but these guys, you go to their website and they show you, the Van Gogh show that's on and what's for lunch in the cafe, because they don't have the money to even put up one film like this. Because if they start with one, they've got to start with others, and you can imagine the sort of backlog of paperwork, and nothing will ever get done. So there's these sort of like, many unofficial histories being written on the web, but those that have taken the chances end up becoming official. And there's problems with that too. UbuWeb is it's a hobby. I mean, what do I know? I'm a poet. What do I know about anything? Honestly, I'm just sort of happen to kind of think that, like Tiffany, this is stuff that sort of should be there.
Yeah. But people, I mean, people base their curriculum around UbuWeb now.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's because it's the only thing of it to teach from, because
Yeah.
it's the only thing that ignores copyright. It's the only thing that's there. You know, UbuWeb and YouTube, perhaps.
YouTube.
So, it's funded completely through the bandwidth and server space is donated by a art school in Mexico City. Otherwise, it's all done volunteer, and that's the way it goes. There's no money. Managed to run a web. I love when people say, "Oh, well, we can't build this website until we have $3 or $4 million, you know, of government funding." I say, "Oh, gee, we managed to do this, you know, with zero. I mean, literally zero money." And you know, it's just, to me, it's sort of an enactment of some version of utopia that sort of doesn't exist anywhere else.
I wanted to thank you. First of all, I've shown 3 pieces from UbuWeb since Brian pointed it out for my class this semester, but I'm interested when you said that people are building a curriculum around this. How are you finding how this circulates? Is there a way to actually track or get feedback other than people writing you and telling you?
I don't want feedback. I don't need feedback. I sort of don't care. People say, how many people come to the site? I say, I don't care if it's 3 or if it's 3 million. I don't take funding, so I'm not obliged to show my numbers. Yeah, and you know, you kind of do what you want. I mean, people just tell me that they use it, and you know, I've met many people. Oh, you know, this thing's been around. You know, students today who are 19 were 2 years old when UbuWeb was in its first incarnation. So for legions of art students or other types of students, this has sort of been a real resource, a real place to come and drink in this material, because it doesn't exist anywhere else.
But isn't it interesting to actually see how the archive itself might circulate transnationally or generate other kinds of either archives or sort of thinking about art in a much more interdisciplinary way that you can too? I mean, I'm just sort of really interested in the way that circulation happens.
I don't, you know, I think it's a great question, but I sort of don't care. And if I have to care what people are saying, then I'm going to get self-conscious and saying, oh my God, you know, like on Ubu, there's like, you know, 10 Vito Acconci films. But Vito Acconci made 150 films. Why are there those 10? Because those are the ones that happen to be floating around file sharing. You know, and I put them up, and the quality is always very bad. I think it's important that the quality be really lousy on Ubu so that you'll go and support proper distribution, you'll support places that you know, show this stuff in cinemas. I mean, you know, what's the cinema scene like here? You know, how easy is it to go to in the Middle East and go see some of this stuff in a movie theater?
I mean, you can't. It's hard, but not just because of the Middle East. Yeah, it's this one in particular. This is very, very rarely shown.
Well, but you have places, you know, in the Anthology Film Archives in New York, and you know, all sorts of Video Umbrella in London, and you know, all these places where you actually, you know, you'll get to see an avant-garde film.
You'll
but
see,
from time to time around here, you'll see this. Is that right?
Around here?
Can we catch?
Yeah, I mean,
can we catch some of this stuff in the local theater?
The Sharjah Biennial, not this one, but the last time they showed a Kamran Shirdel documentary about Dubai from the 70s. I mean, yeah, things pop up from time to time. I don't think the film festivals here are so archivally oriented. Right?
I'm also interested, is a lot of this stuff floating around on if I go to Pirate Bay, how much, you know, historical Middle Eastern stuff can I catch? I know I can catch plenty of pop stuff, but really good historical quality. Can anybody, you know, is it on Pirate Bay? There's no torrents floating around of this stuff?
A couple things.
I work on Syria, so I know there, for example, IFAD, the Institut Français des Études Arabes Damas, will screen things that are not permitted to be screened. The Goethe Institute will screen things that aren't permitted to be screened, but you have to know that it's being screened. Omar Amirali's work, you know, I saw I saw you had some of his work, but all of his work has been screened at the French Institute, for example, but none of that work can be screened openly because he had been, until his recent death, a very vocal critic of the regime. So I don't know what it's like in other Arab countries, but it's often at European cultural centers where work gets screened, and it gets screened without a lot of advertisements.
And also
Or
that's
small art spaces.
the way it gets leaked. You know, some guy will just rip the DVDs and throw them up onto Kargarga or onto other private file sharing places, or sometimes even find their way to Ubu. I mean, I get a lot of this stuff because I've been doing this for so long on Ubu. I get invited to every private file sharing group in the world where there are fanatics that are dying to just share this stuff, but they share that with 5 other people. And UbuWeb becomes sort of the Robin Hood of the avant-garde, taking it from the few and giving it to everybody. But the funny thing is, I keep a low profile too. I've removed UbuWeb from Google. You can't get it on Google. You know, they write books about how to get your Google ranking up. I want it off because of kind of insane, you know, people that want to suppress the material, insane copyright holders who think that there's value, economic value, where there's no chance. You know, you can't sell this stuff. You couldn't even give it away. Most people don't want it. And so, but UbuWeb is on all the bad search engines, you know, like Bing or Alta Vista. We're still on Alta Vista. But Google, it's gone from. So the whole thing sort of becomes underground. It's like hiding in plain sight. There's no passwords. There's no donation boxes. There's no advertising. But it's available if you know about it, which brings it back to a beautiful sort of underground network. You can see things on Google that link to it, but you can't see it directly there. And I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. I just want to add that there are a lot of small art spaces, you know, in Cairo and Beirut.
Can you name some of these
Yeah,
great
sure.
places?
In
that,
Cairo,
to see this
there's the
stuff?
townhouse, and there's actually a space in Cairo called Beirut. So it's Beirut and Cairo. In Beirut, there's Beirut Art Center, which we've done programming for. There's 98 Weeks, which is a much more independent space there. You know, gosh, where else?
How about here? Does where, you know, is there a place showing this stuff here? Sorry? At the Goethe Institute here. You'll see it?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, oh, they have a satellite in Abu Dhabi. Cool.
What?
Oh, in Dubai. Okay, I thought satellite was like their satellite location here. Traffic is a space in Dubai.
And satellite, a satellite of the gallery?
Oh, okay, cool.
I don't know. You know, to me, it's a shame that this stuff isn't in wide circulation. You know, I think it's our community service to get out what's sitting on VHS tapes. You know, and by the way, if you have stuff,
yeah, give it to me.
Get in touch with Tiffany. You know, you have stuff. I know you've all got stuff on dusty old VHS tapes rotting away. You know, digitize it and throw it to her and let's share it and let's keep this history alive and this work, you know, very relevant. I think it clearly. Can you talk about some of the younger artists, the new artists that have been directly inspired by some of this work? Could you mention some of the connections between contemporary practices and some of these historical practices?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I have a really exciting anecdote where someone told me it changed their life or something like that.
But where do you see it?
But I think people are definitely especially interested in the young artists, probably especially interested in the histories from wherever it is that they're coming from. And yeah, I think because there aren't central resources in the places, so that, you know, oddly enough, even if they may be in Armenia, maybe they have to come to this website, UbuWeb, to be able to easily access, you know, Parajanov films or Peleshian films.
You know, it's great. I'll show you something funny. Go to the UbuWeb homepage.
Okay.
So on the homepage is a picture of Samuel Beckett. And I was so pleased to find out that UbuWeb plays freely in China. You know, I mean, the home of censorship. And I think the reason is, and believe me, there's enough. Go back up a little bit to Beckett. There's so much political, sexual, ultra content on the site. But I get the feeling that the censors in China hit this front page and said, oh, this must be a site for retirees, you know, old people, and there's all this text. It can't possibly have, you know, it's fine, let's just, you know, get out of here. And I think like one of the things that I really love to do about Ubu is like, you know, keep an old, like an image for the site as an older person, the wisdom of age, of course the wisdom of Beckett, not to mention how cool Samuel Beckett is. But it actually puts off, a lot of people hit this site and they go, oh God, you know, I don't want to be on a site that features an old man on it. So, you know, there's all these kind of survival strategies that one does.
Thank you for your talking, and I'm interested in the avant-garde filmmaking in this area, and you showed a few clips. And I wonder if there's any more formal experiment in filmmaking in this region, because your clips are more or less related to the, you know, socio-political situation, which makes sense because, you know, of the history of political situations here. While at the same time, you know, the core of avant-garde, and this is related to the previous question about the boundary of avant-garde, you know. I mean, it's still a little problematic, but then we can see the core of avant-garde art and experiment, and especially cinema, in Western countries has been more or less quite formal, and then it's much more about the, you know, the medium itself, right? It's medium-specific formal aspects, and then experiments on the cinema in terms of its audio-visual effect, rather than just the content and the message, right? So I was wondering if there is anything like that on the serious level in this region produced, and if there is anything, then could you, is there anything on the web so that you can show? Otherwise, if there's nothing like that, what would be the background? Is it because simply, you know, this region is so politically charged that, you know, the kind of experiment is simply a luxury, or is not yet kind of accommodated by the government and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And you know, now that you ask it, I'm really having a hard time thinking of something that's a medium-specific work, at least historically. You know, like, I don't know, like, you know, Flickr films or something like that. And why? Gosh, I mean, it's probably, as you say, I mean, it's like, it's a different relationship to art making. I mean, people really had something they want to say, you know, about what was going on in the world around them, and maybe that is just, yeah, not the proper outlet. So I think there's definitely some formal experimentation within the works, you know, especially a lot of the music that we have, et cetera. But just this raw, purely formal work, yeah, I guess it just doesn't really fit the paradigm.
So anyway, in conclusion, I think the idea really about Ubu is it's really a placeholder, and we're waiting for you to build something better, something, you know, where you actually know what you're doing. Maybe you have an idea. And my dream is for something to come along that would render this site obsolete. You know, something that you know, our little subjective histories here, you know, illegal, bad quality, appropriated writing, et cetera, et cetera. My dream is really, you know, for somebody to do what you're doing so much better that they would never come here again. Something well-funded. So I'm going to throw that challenge out and hope that really you put us out of business. That would be fantastic. Okay, so thank you so much for coming.